Today we talk with Shirley Hager, who is the retired associate professor with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. She's the lead author of the gatherings Reimagining Indigenous-Settler Relations. And today we talk about the book and what the book signifies, what it means, and what message the book holds for the First Nations and the Wabanaki territory and to the natives, non-natives, and to the settlers. Here's Shirley Hager.
The gatherings was a series of meetings that were held in the Gulf of Maine bioregion, also Wabanaki territory, in the 1980s and 90s. There were a total of 11 in all, and they took place over long 4-day weekends where Indigenous and non-native participants came together to simply sit in circle together and to get to know one another, share our stories, and to explore if true relationship is possible.
Can you tell us about the Wabanaki territory and what it signifies?
Well, I think a Wabanaki person would be far better than I to say what it signifies. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that Wabanaki territory is the territory that we think of as the Gulf of Maine bioregion. It includes the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoqey, also known as Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy, as well as the Wabanaki peoples.
Can you tell us about other authors who have contributed to this book?
Yes. There were 14 of us who told their stories in the book, 7 Wabanaki and 7 non-native. Then we had our friend Frances Hancock, who is a New Zealander, who was here at the time, and she gave throughout this whole project enormous time and commitment to the project, as she's a writer and a researcher and works closely with the Maori people in New Zealand. And she wrote our afterword. In terms of the Wabanaki people the Indigenous people who contributed to this, we had representation from all of the 4 federally recognized tribes. The Wabanaki have a presence in Maine, but not an official community. The Wabanaki participants were represented by both men and women, people who had a diversity of perspectives, which I think is important, so that we all understand that Indigenous people have a diversity of experiences and backgrounds, just as non-natives do.
I have asked this question to you before, but I'm going to ask you again. How will this book preserve the legacy of the First Nations?
Well, I think, again, I don't feel qualified to say how it will preserve the legacy of First Nations. A Wabanaki person would be more able to answer that question. What I think I can say is that we felt that in terms of preserving the legacy of what we had done together, of what we had learned in bringing our peoples together, was what was important. And there's so many areas of conflict and misunderstanding between Indigenous and settler peoples now. And we felt that we had learned some lessons in terms of how to come together as equals in mutually respectful relationships. So it felt very important that we write this book to capture those lessons and to pass them on. Also, shortly, there will be a teacher's guide coming out that utilizes the book and helps teachers, high school teachers primarily, look at the book in terms of how they might use it, how they might give their students experiences such as we had together without culturally appropriating. And the teacher's guide will be keyed to learning results, both in the United States and Canada. So we're very excited about that. And we feel that, this is our effort at preserving the legacy of an experience that meant so much and was life-changing for so many of us all those years ago.
Can you tell us more about the teacher's guide, when it's going to be released and how it's going to be implemented? Because I assume that many non-native teachers have to teach the book, right? So, so how will they teach the book? What's the process?
Well, I was not the one who did the teacher's guide. It was created under the auspices of the Maine Curriculum Leaders Association. It's been reviewed by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars, and it is at the publishers right now. So I assume that by the end of the year, it should be available. So I would say within weeks, it should be available. It will be an online resource, not a printed resource.
Okay.
And I believe there are plans, at least here in Maine, for the guide to be incorporated into teacher training days that will be offered. I was really impressed with the teachers who created this guide. They were extremely respectful and sensitive, I felt, to the work of the book. And what they're trying to do with it is to actually help teachers, guide teachers to be able to incorporate the principles of listening, of those kinds of things we learned from Wabanaki individuals about what it means to sit in the circle and to be respectful and to learn how to listen to one another, and to resolve conflicts, what it means, that the teachers felt are applicable to so many situations. Again, with guidance about how to lift up the very human and universal aspects of our experience without borrowing or appropriating specific cultural traditions, which was very important to us.
As a non-native author, how challenging it was for you to write this book?
Well, I was greatly assisted by a planning group that consisted of 3 Indigenous co-authors and 2 non-native, myself and our friend Francis from New Zealand. And so whenever one of my guiding principles in writing the book was I tried never to make a statement that presumed this was what the Indigenous individuals felt or said, that I only reported what my experience had been or what I had been told directly. And so that was really critical. And in addition to that, my fail-safe was that the Wabanaki members of the planning group were there for me to bounce off of them any questions that I had, to confirm any statements that I made, and to have them really sign off on anything that had been said in the book. So one unique aspect of the book, I think, is that it was not written from the perspective of one person, or it wasn't simply me doing interviews and then going off and creating the book. Those interviews that we did were transcribed word for word, and they were sent back to the contributors, and they had full authority over what was if they wanted something omitted, if they wanted something added, it was done. And then when the story was complete, was sent back to them, they had the ability to approve or disapprove of any aspect of it. And not only their own words, but the book as a whole. So it was a collaborative process filled with checks and balances, so that when the book was finished, everyone signed off on it before it even saw the light of day. Mm-hmm. And that was really important, because there is, we have a long tradition of non-native writers, scholars going into Indigenous communities and getting information and going off and writing a book, getting a degree, making money off the book. And we did not want that in any way.
So how did the first gathering happen, and what was the main motive of the gatherings?
Well, back in around 1985, there was an organization that was based in Maine called the Center for Vision and Policy. And they set out to try to create a model, a vision for sustainability for the whole Gulf of Maine bioregion. And by sustainability, they meant economic, environmental, and social justice sustainability. And one of the fundamental principles that they operated on was that in order to create such a vision, that the voices of the indigenous people, the people of the land, must be part of this. That was a basically white organization, and so not particularly connected to indigenous groups or people at the time. And so that was about the time I got very interested in it. And so a group of us set out to try to find Wabanaki individuals who would be interested in pursuing this. And so over the course of about a year, during that time, I met Gisatanamuk, who is a Wampanoag, now elder. And I met him in the course of that exploration. He connected us with others. Some of us met with what was then the New Brunswick Native Women's Council, and met with them. And we were given names, and we had numbers of conversations and correspondences. And that resulted in an event in 1986 that it was more of an educational forum. It was held in Maine. It brought together some Wabanaki individuals who had agreed to speak with us about their history and our shared history, and to educate us on current concerns in their lives, speaking to a mainly non-native audience. And we did that 2 years in a row. We began to get to know one another a bit, get comfortable with one another a bit. And at the end of that second forum, I had been the organizer of these events. And so several Wabanaki individuals came to me and said that they thought this effort had promise, but that they wanted to propose a different way of meeting, a way that they would be more comfortable in, a more traditional way of meeting, and that they suggested that we come together in a traditional council circle around the fire, and that they would create that for us, and they would provide ceremony that would help us in our deliberations, and that they would take care of all of that. That's what would be appropriate, of course, and that our job would be to find the location and get people there. So that changed everything, and that began this series of meetings that took course over the next 5 or 6 years, twice a year. Long weekends where we camped together, we brought food, we cooked, we hung out in the evenings together, and we spent our days sitting in these circles around the fire and sharing our lives and talking about issues that impacted our lives. And Out of that, all of that time together, relationships really grew and solidified that led a number of us many years later to come together with the dream of writing a book about what we learned.
You did mention how you got involved in writing this book as the lead author, but like, do you want to tell us more, like how you gathered all the authors and maybe you motivated them, or you were the lead author, or you were the first one to tell them saying, let's write this book?
Well, it's actually, it's not as clear cut as that. I mentioned our friend Frances Hancock, who is now back in her home in New Zealand, but she was here on a scholarship and for several years, and also working in Maine. And she is a writer. And so Frances came back for a visit in 2008. And we were going around Maine and New Brunswick visiting our friends from the gatherings. And she and I engaged in conversations around, this dream that I had always had of someone writing a book about this experience. But I did not intend or necessarily want it to be me. It just seemed so huge, and I'd never done anything like that before. And so Frances said, well, I'll come back and I'll do interviews and I'll write the book. And so we set out for a year or more writing grants so that we could bring people together again, talking to various people to see if they would be interested in being part of this. There was a whole group of us that wound up together at an event at the University of Maine, and we started talking about it, and people were excited. And just as we were to have our first reunion gathering to talk about all of this, Frances was due to fly back, and she had a medical emergency, eye surgery that prevented her from flying. So we just said, what are we going to do? And I had been the coordinator of these gatherings, and I had had some experience writing, but nothing like this. And we just said, this has to go on. We've come too far. So the group asked me if I would step into that role, and I said that I would. And you never know what you're agreeing to. And Frances was faithful in supporting this effort from a distance, being a mentor to me, really, and being available all along the way at every stage of the book. So it's been a real, and I just want to say that, I mean, it's just been an incredibly collaborative effort, all of us, a labor of love for all of us.
So how does this book reimagine Indigenous and settler relations?
I would say, first of all, it imagines us coming together and starting over. It imagines us meeting on equal footing. It imagines us coming together with a knowledge that doing so is of mutual benefit, and with great respect for what each of us brings to that circle. And there's so many instances. We're engaged in one right now here in Maine where a colonial government, the state of Maine or a province or federal governments, they hold so much power. It's not an equal relationship. And yet the indigenous peoples have never ceded their sovereignty. They are nations unto themselves. And so when we begin to think of acknowledging a nation-to-nation relationship, it is only to the benefit of all of us. And, you know, we have a saying here in our efforts to support the Wabanaki in trying to amend the Settlement Act that they've been under. You know, when the Wabanaki thrive, we all thrive. Mm-hmm. And Maine has been in the business for a long time of keeping down a whole segment of population that is within the borders of what is now Maine. And it not only causes untold harm to Wabanaki peoples, but it diminishes all of us as a state and mm-hmm. as neighbors.
Mm-hmm. So my last question is, what is the way forward for the gatherings in Canada and the United States, or to be precise, the Wabanaki territory?
Well, I think that we don't know exactly the way forward. I don't know that, you know, when the gathering started, there was really nothing like it. And the Center for Vision and Policy was formed and led primarily by non-Native individuals. And so the gatherings were always under the umbrella of that primarily white organization. And Mi'kmaq has said in the book, you know, when the gathering started, there was nothing available. There weren't places in the community where Native and non-Native people naturally came together. You know, there are lots of places where white people naturally come together, boards and committees and conferences, but there was nothing like that bringing together Indigenous and settler peoples. Now there is. Now, I mean, what I know here in Maine is there are many, there are organizations, there are many events and presentations and all kinds of efforts that are Indigenous-led that non-Natives can join into and support. And as a result of working side by side, a natural result is getting to know one another. So we wrote the book in a sense for efforts like that, so that people could, as they come together, could learn from our experience of long-term relationships, how non-Natives can behave, how we might work to center ourselves less, to listen more than we speak, to ask permission, to not go where we're not invited. Those kinds of principles we feel are still very relevant, and yet the way in which people gather, there are now many more opportunities. So I think even in coming together to enact legislation in state or provincial legislatures, these principles can apply. So, you know, I don't know that the answer is to go out and recreate what we did, but our hope is that in the places where people find themselves, that the gatherings has something to offer in terms of thinking about how we meet together.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your words. And we hope the gatherings will continue to exist in coming days.
Thank you, Arun, very much. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Shirley Hager joining us from Maine, the lead author of the gatherings. For the NB Media Co-op, this is Arun Budhathoki.